Hey there folks, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and are you ready for me to talk about the 80s and pop music from that time period a little bit too much? Because today I wanted to talk about the new Allie X record, Girl with No Face. Allie X was on an uphill trajectory when her 2020 album Cape God dropped, as well as that being her most recent studio album. It's also important to note that the popularity of songs like Devil I Know and Paper Love, as well as the Mitski collaboration Susie Save Your Love, were causing her name to get thrown around a little bit more. She was gaining a very loyal fan base overall, but despite all of that, her name really didn't get tossed around a ton in larger discussions of music. That's not for a lack of popularity, it's just a general statement of, at least from my experience, fact. Allie X is not the kind of name that the average person is really going to name drop when talking about great creative minds in the present music industry, and that's not to dismiss her actual creative ability. I just feel like she's kind of gone under the radar of a lot of people. And I mean, hey, the pandemic certainly didn't help with that. Again, Cape God came out in 2020. I don't know if you know what happened in 2020, but it was a rough one, followed by 2021, which was also a rough one, and you get my point. Allie X was making a name for herself in some circles, hadn't quite achieved true stardom level status, but at the same time, it felt like she was going places before the world kind of came to a halt, and thus making her career come to a halt. And now here she is with Girl with No Face, her latest studio album that seems to kind of want to be the bold, creative, artistic leap that changes how people perceive her. While Girl with No Face is a flawed and imperfect record that has its own fair share of kinks to work out, I really do feel like this is the single most sonically distinct and artistically impressive album that Allie X has put out to date. The vast majority of the instrumentals on Girl with No Face are what really allowed this record to stand out in the context of Allie X's discography. Now, for a little bit of context, this record is very synth-driven, and previous Allie X albums have also been synth-driven in their own respective ways, but generally speaking, her prior LPs have leaned more into the realm of alternative pop music, thus really kind of putting the instrumentals to the back burner, allowing for a more lyric-forward style to shine through at least 9 times out of 10, and that's not a bad thing. But it certainly is a very specific style that I don't think is really present here. I find that this record highlights and showcases the instrumentals of this record much more than anything we've seen from her in the past. If I'm being totally honest, that really is kind of a benefit for this record because Girl with No Face as an album feels like Allie X going down a pretty entirely different creative avenue for herself. And I can't really complain about that. The vast majority of this record feels ripped straight from the 80s, and that may not sound impressive on paper. I mean, retro pop revivalism has come and gone in waves of relevance for decades at this point, but the slick disco and synth funk influenced sounds of artists like Dua Lipa and Jessie Ware don't really have anything in terms of pure direct influence on this album, Girl with No Face, which honestly feels, again, directly ripped from the aforementioned decade. I mean, funny enough, despite actually name-dropping Stereolab on the track Hardware Software, it kind of feels like this album is most deeply indebted to artists like Aha, Pat Benatar, The Human League, and other stadium-level popularity titans of 80s pop and pop rock, more specifically synth-based pop and pop rock, the kind of artists that completely altered what was known to be popular within music at that point, the kind of artists that without them we probably wouldn't have such incredibly lush and electronic-heavy music today. Also, I know I said electronic, so I'd just like to clarify before any total dorks like myself go into the comments, like, actually, those sounds were influenced by Kraftwerk and Neu, among other bands. Yeah, I know, but this album sounds more Flock of Seagulls, less Yellow Magic Orchestra, alright? My point is, this album sounds like a very, very specific sonic aesthetic from the 1980s specifically, and, I mean, do with that information what you will. I enjoy it personally, but it's definitely one of those things that can ultimately feel dated, even if, like here, it's presented in a modern context, so I can see why someone wouldn't really like the direction Allie X is going on this record creatively, but as for myself, I find a fair amount to enjoy in it. The raw, largely unaltered synth sounds going on here on this record feel deeply reminiscent of early synth pop artists, and in turn are equally as pure as they are cheesy, and in that way I kind of like them actually. I feel like they strike a nice balance here in that regard, and they feel like solid homages to that era of pop music without feeling like it's dated to that time period specifically. But at the end of the day, really the only thing truly rooting Girl with No Face in the current era of popular synth-based music is the fact that the drums here and the drum programming, the drum machines, sound very modern. They're very thick, they're heavy, they got a lot of bass behind them that I don't think you really saw from a lot of the album here's influences that it's taking from. But beyond that, this is basically a tribute album to an entire era, at least musically speaking, and I don't really think that's a bad thing. I mean, hey, I'm totally against ripping off an entire artist's bit or something like that. There's a reason why I'm not a Greta Van Fleet fan in particular, among many other groups that attempt to do that kind of thing. But I think it's another thing entirely to do your own take on a very specific sound, or in this case, a very specific sonic movement from a certain time period. And for what it's worth, I think that Allie X executes this very specific brand of synth-based pop music pretty well overall. It's not the most amazing take you'll hear on it, and I think if you want something genuinely fresh sounding, again, go for some of the artists I mentioned before, like Dua Lipa and Jessie Ware, or even some other less recent examples like Fever era Kylie Minogue. That being said, I still think that this album holds up. So yeah, from an instrumental perspective, from a sort of sonic aesthetic perspective, this album never totally feels like a knockoff. I think Girl with No Face, if anything, again comes across as more of a musical tribute to an era of popular music that completely changed the music industry and what was commercially viable as we know it. And Allie X manages to dive more directly and literally into the sound in her own way than the vast majority of her peers often are brave enough to do, even if throughout this album I'm half expecting to hear I Need a Hero or Love is a Battlefield before her vocals kick in, which I guess could be an issue for some, but for me, not a big deal. Now, the actual vocal performances here, I feel, are a little bit more hit or miss in nature, and I think that's a shame because when Allie X is good, she's better than good. She's generally great. I mean, at times, she can be a performer with plenty of charisma, plenty of personality, and even a somewhat standout figure within throwback pop music right now, despite this really kind of being her first effort to sort of go in that direction of appeal to a specific audience. But I digress. There are so many moments here, or at least a fair amount, that I feel can be highlighted as strong vocal performances. You Slept on Me has the perfect amount of attitude and personality behind it, so that when you place it with the very well-produced new wave kind of instrumental going on there, you get a song that is a nice meeting between a contemporary pop star and classic pop sounds. And even some of the less memorable tracks like John and Jonathan, for example, are saved from being totally mediocre via impassioned vocal performances. When she's good, Allie X is really good. That's what I'm trying to say here. She's not an untalented person. She's not an unskilled performer. I just feel that there are too many moments here where she doesn't get to show off how good she can be. There are a lot of times where I feel like she, as a vocalist, conforms to the instrumentals of the songs rather than remolding the songs around her presence, and that's not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, but it does translate to some moments feeling a bit stiff, feeling a bit awkward. Some of the choruses on this record especially just feel a bit jagged in a way that I can't really say is all that successful, at least to my ears. I think the most major example of that would be the track Off With Her Tits, which is, in theory, a very striking song. It is an incredibly passionate song discussing body image in the context of femininity, and I just wish that it didn't feel like she was sort of mumbling and rushing her way through the chorus just so she can finish it to get back to the part of the instrumental where she's supposed to deliver the next verse. I just think that maybe had some instrumentals had been reworked to allow her to flourish a little bit more as a vocalist, this would be a much more successful execution of a lot of passages on this album. That isn't to say that Allie X fluctuates between being a good vocalist and a bad vocalist. She's always good. She, again, does not lack talent or skill or anything like that. I just mean to say that there are equal amounts of moments on this record that do and do not allow her to showcase those talents, and I think at times she's sort of forced into a corner and doesn't get to deliver her best work, which, again, like I said, is a shame because there are so many well-executed moments here that it just is an absolute bummer that there are so many not well-executed moments that sort of even things out to a fair extent, at least. I would also make the argument that a good chunk of the songwriting on Girl With No Face isn't totally up to snuff here either. I mean, there are some tracks that feel fairly well written, perhaps the best of them being the pretty sardonic Putting on a Brave Face anthem that is Staying Power, but outside of that song specifically, you have a lot of songs that I don't feel really stand out lyrically, or at times in the album's weaker and worst moments, feel just a bit out of place, despite some pretty admirable ideas and some ambitious themes being tackled here. A big example of that to me is what should have actually been an album highlight that unfortunately wasn't, the album opening track Weird World, which is honestly a pretty interesting song from a thematic standpoint. It tackles her realizing that her life is, as stated by the artist herself, quote, tangled and twisted and not sustainable, end quote, and then she uses that moment and that emotional momentum to make changes for the better in her own life. And I think that this should be a pretty seamlessly empowering track. And the instrumental, which is excellent, proves that to be partially true in execution, but it just feels like the wording of lines like, I used to be a dream girl, but the world interfered, at least now I know why, now I know I'm weird, just results in a cut with songwriting that's way more rigid than it's really trying to be, and at the end of the day, because of that, it sort of feels a little bit difficult to connect with the deeper emotional qualities going on there. I would say the same thing can be said about one of the lowlights of the album for me, the track Black Eye, which, again, thematically, conceptually, super ambitious, impressive, respectable song. It's a track that's meant to be about putting yourself through too many difficulties in life and eventually normalizing excessive amounts of stress to the point of nearly convincing yourself to enjoy those moments. I think thematically, it's an excellent song, but it's kind of hard to focus on the deeper meaning of the piece when you have lines like, oh, hit me with that super pain, 'cause a hit feels like I'm dancing in the rain. They just come across as tragically forced, as if there were sort of rhymeless, free-flowing poems that were written for each of these songs that were just forced to be turned into rhyme scheme-based poems afterwards at some point, and because of that, the structure and the fluidity of them is just all sorts of janky at this point, and it's just a struggle, because lyrically there are a lot of great ideas here, it's just disappointing how few of them feel well executed. I won't say that the songwriting on Girl With No Face is outright horrible or anything like that. Honestly, the vast majority of the record is just pretty so-so in terms of lyrical content. I can't really judge it in one way or another, but it does often feel like a lot of the songwriting and lyricism here is a bit clumsy, a bit too rigid for its own good, and ultimately ends up dragging down some songs that maybe would have been noticeably better if the lyrics had just gone through a few different rewrites. Because again, there are so many songs here tackling deeply personal topics on behalf of Allie X, and I have nothing but respect and admiration for that. I just wish it was conveyed in a way that paralleled with the actual instrumentals, worked with the actual instrumentals better than they ultimately do here. Girl With No Face is a flawed record, without question. I don't think even the biggest fans of this album would necessarily argue against that, and I mean, there's some janky songwriting, some of the vocal performances don't fit, and whether you enjoy or absolutely despise the violent 80s-ness of this album's sonic aesthetic is really just a matter of personal taste. I personally enjoy it well enough. That being said, I do think that Allie X has enough personality to carry this record to its finale, even if there are some lows here and there throughout the track list, and you pair her with some nicely produced instrumentals and manage to fairly accurately represent the very specific time period of pop music that this album is going for, and I think that there was a fair amount of success behind this album, at least an equal amount to the failures. Obviously, I'm not trying to chalk art up here to success and failure. That feels kind of pointless and demeaning towards the concept of art itself, but my point still stands. There's just as much stuff that works here as stuff that I feel personally doesn't work here. That isn't to mention that there is a lot of legitimate artistic growth here. I would not have expected this album from Allie X based on her prior works. And Girl With No Face, despite all of its issues, does mark a major leap forward for Allie X creatively and hopefully commercially as well. It is nigh impossible to argue with this album's status as a major piece of creative evolution for Allie X, and it just so happens that the majority of the music found within it is consistently at least enjoyable, and I can't really fault it for that. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.